On June 25, 2025, after nearly 50 years on death row, Richard Gerald Jordan was executed by lethal injection in Mississippi. At 79 years old, he held the grim record as the state's oldest and longest-serving death row inmate. His story isn't just about one crime. It's about a legal system that was pushed to its limits and a man who cheated death 4 separate times.
The death penalty, I think, is appropriate in situations. I think this is one of the situations that is appropriate.
In this video, we'll look at the shocking crime that started it all, the legal journey that dragged on for 5 decades, and finally, Richard's last moments. Welcome to Primetime Crime. Richard was born in Hattiesburg, Mississippi on May 25, 1946, and grew up just down the road in the small town of Petal. After graduating from Petal High School, he followed a familiar path for many young men at the time. He joined the Army and served in Vietnam. When he came back from the war, Richard tried to settle into a normal life. He got married, had 3 children, and did his best to support his family. For a while, he even managed a fertilizer plant in Louisiana. But by January of 1976, his financial situation had begun to fall apart. There were car payments, boat payments, department store credit cards, and other bills that just kept stacking up. Richard was simply drowning in debt. Eventually, out of desperation, he came up with a plan. A plan that would end up ruining more than just his own life. Richard decided to target someone from a wealthy family and hold them for ransom. He picked Gulfport, Mississippi as his hunting ground. At a pawn shop in Baton Rouge, he traded in his 16-gauge shotgun for a .38 caliber pistol. Then he lied to his parents, telling them he was heading out to take a physical exam for a job on an offshore oil rig. After spending a few days getting familiar with Gulfport, Richard put his plan into motion. He called Gulf National Bank from a payphone and asked to speak with someone who handled commercial loans. The bank told him Charles "Chuck" Martyr could help. So, Richard looked up Martyr's home address in a phone book. On January 12, 1976, Richard drove to the Martyr family home. He knocked on the door, pretending to be an electric company worker who needed to check the circuit breakers. It was a simple lie, but it worked. Inside the house was 34-year-old Edwina Martyr and her 3-year-old son, who was sleeping. Her 9-year-old was at catechism class, and her husband Chuck was at work. Edwina had no reason to suspect the polite man at her door was there to destroy her life. Richard forced Edwina into his car and made her drive into the DeSoto National Forest. Once they were deep in the forest, he brought her out of the vehicle. What happened next was contested, but the result was the same. Richard claimed he only meant to hold Edwina for ransom, but said he fired a shot when she tried to run. He insisted the bullet was meant to go over her head. But the state presented evidence that told a different story. Blood spatter analysis showed that Edwina was motionless when she was shot, likely kneeling. After killing Edwina, Richard did something that showed just how little emotion he had about what he'd done. He went to a movie theater nearby and watched Death Wish, a violent revenge film. While the credits rolled, Edwina's body lay cooling in the forest, and her family had no idea she was already gone. Then, Richard began his twisted game with Chuck Martyr. He called Chuck and demanded $50,000 in ransom, telling the grieving husband that Edwina was still alive. The 2 men spoke again that evening and decided on the exact location where Martyr would drop off the money. Chuck drove to the spot that night, but he wasn't alone. Sheriff's deputies followed him, hoping to catch the kidnapper. Richard had been watching from the woods. He spotted the officers immediately and realized Chuck had brought backup. The next day, Richard called Chuck again, angry that he had tried to pull a fast one. But instead of backing off, he revised his plan. He lowered the ransom to $25,000 and gave Chuck new instructions. This time, Chuck was to make several turns before getting on the freeway so the police couldn't follow. On January 13th, Chuck left the cash at a spot near Interstate 10 and Canal Road in Gulfport at 9 a.m. An FBI agent and a Harrison County Sheriff's deputy were waiting in a pickup truck near the site. The deputy was Larkin Smith, who would later become sheriff and then a U.S. congressman. When Richard arrived to retrieve the money, law enforcement moved in. But Richard wasn't going down without a fight. He rammed the sheriff's vehicle into a ditch and kept driving even when shots were fired at his car. For a moment, it looked like he might escape. But Richard's luck ran out. He abandoned his car and tried to flee, but a Gulfport police officer found him in a taxi at about 1 p.m. the same day. He was arrested, and most of the ransom money was recovered. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Richard confessed to police officers that he had killed Edwina. He took them to her body and the murder weapon. The crime that had started as a desperate grab for money had ended with a young mother dead and a family destroyed. What happened next would become one of the most complex legal sagas in American death penalty history. In July 1976, Richard went on trial for taking Edwina and causing her death. Because the case had gotten so much media attention in Harrison County, the trial was moved to Jackson County to give him a better shot at a fair jury. Prosecutors called 24 witnesses, but no one testified for the defense. After 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on capital murder charges. At the time, capital murder carried an automatic death sentence in Mississippi. So, Richard was sentenced to die. But then, there was already a case before the Supreme Court of Mississippi challenging automatic death sentences as unconstitutional. Later that year, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that automatic death sentences constituted cruel and unusual punishment. Therefore, Richard received a new trial. A second trial began in February 1977, this time with separate phases to determine guilt and punishment. Richard was found guilty again on March 2nd, and the sentencing hearing was held the same day. During the punishment phase, Richard's defense attorney told the jury that Richard had been a good person until he was about 30. Something happened to him then, and I'll never know what it is. He was and remains a sick man, the attorney said. The defense called character witnesses, including Richard's parents and a prison chaplain who had prayed with Richard for more than a year. While jurors were deliberating that evening, they told the judge that one juror was not in favor of giving Richard the death penalty. The defense moved for a mistrial, but the motion was denied. The jury eventually reached a unanimous decision and handed down another death sentence at about 7 p.m. But Richard's legal team wasn't finished fighting. In the early 1980s, Richard challenged his second death sentence because of improper jury instructions. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that jurors should have been given specific guidance on aggravating circumstances. The court vacated Richard's death sentence and ordered a new sentencing hearing. In 1983, Richard received his third death sentence. But once again, his lawyers found grounds for appeal. They argued that Richard had been stopped from introducing testimony about his good behavior in prison, including his work with electricity and wind tunnel designs. The case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, which disagreed with lower courts and set aside the third death sentence in 1986. The next year, the Mississippi Supreme Court ordered yet another sentencing hearing. By 1991, prosecutors were tired of the endless appeals. Instead of pursuing a fourth death sentence, the Harrison County District Attorney offered Richard a plea deal: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, as long as he agreed not to challenge his sentence anymore. Richard accepted the deal. But there was one problem. At the time of the plea agreement, Mississippi sentencing guidelines only allowed 2 sentences for a first-time capital defendant like Richard: death or life imprisonment with the possibility of parole. Life without parole wasn't legally available until Mississippi law changed in 1994. When Richard discovered that his sentence had been improper, he challenged it, hoping to get life with the possibility of parole instead. But the courts had a different idea. Instead of modifying his sentence, they vacated it entirely and gave him a new sentencing hearing. In April 1998, nearly 22 years after the original crime, Richard faced his fourth death penalty hearing. This time, there would be no plea deals. The prosecutor who had originally opposed the 1991 plea agreement was now in charge, and he was determined to see Richard executed.
He lied to everybody. He didn't lie to me because I never believed it to begin with. If he had just simply taken his life without parole, we wouldn't be here talking about whether or not his punishment's going to be cruel and unusual.
Richard's lawyers called 12 witnesses, including family members and prison employees who testified about his work as a trustee, his electrical projects, and the short stories and novel he had written while incarcerated. But the prosecutor argued that Richard had done this work to benefit himself, not society. The jury deliberated for just 35 minutes before handing down Richard's fourth death sentence. The jury foreman called the decision a no-brainer and commented on Richard's apparent lack of remorse and the 22 years that had elapsed since the initial verdict. Richard tried to appeal this sentence too, arguing that prosecutorial vindictiveness had led to the death penalty pursuit. But the courts ruled against him. The U.S. Supreme Court rejected his final appeal in 2015. But even with all legal avenues exhausted, Richard's execution was delayed for years by challenges to Mississippi's lethal injection procedures. The state had difficulty obtaining execution drugs, and death row inmates successfully challenged the use of alternative drugs in court, bringing executions to a halt in 2012. But at this point, his execution was only a matter of time. On June 25, 2025, after nearly 50 years on death row, Richard Gerald Jordan's time finally ran out. For Richard Gerald Jordan's final meal and last words, please keep an eye on the description and comment section of this video. I will be updating them both to include the latest information as it is released to the public. Thank you for watching this segment on Primetime Crime. Please leave a comment below with your thoughts. I read them all. Richard's story serves as a reminder of how desperation can drive ordinary people to commit extraordinary evil, and how the wheels of justice, while slow, eventually turn.